Hey everyone, welcome back to the My Move Fall webinar series hosted by the HPE Collective. Today's webinar is the fourth in a series of 6 episodes. Our host, Greg Dreyer, the founder of My Move, is here to discuss a very important topic with us today, the gender activity gap. Before we dive into it, I'd like to say thank you to all of our listeners for your support over the last several weeks. We are very close to surpassing 100 listens across our channels, so we hope that you will continue to listen and share HPE Radio with your friends. And with all of that said, I'm going to toss it over to Greg Dreyer to get us started today.
Thanks very much, Jordan, and nice to be here again. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, I think this is number 4 of 6. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I'm also really wary that this is being presented by myself as someone who identifies as a man, and Jordan is obviously co-hosting, and he's also a man. And there's maybe that is somewhat problematic in that we clearly don't really understand the activity experiences of girls, young women, etc. Having said that, we welcome your comments as always, and if we get stuff that especially that female colleagues think that we're off the mark with, then reach out, and we're very open to hearing what you have to say. But this has been something in my professional and my personal life as a parent, especially, that has always been really, really dear to me. And I think I would drop it into the wider conversation around inclusive PE and inclusive physical activity in sport. And we've touched upon some of those themes in the last 3 weeks. So within inclusion, and this is where I think it gets a little bit tricky. So right from the start, I want to just flag up what's often referred to as intersectionality. And I said that as a man, I don't and haven't experienced what physical activity might feel like in the environments that girls and young women might take part in sport and activity. But of course, I don't want to say, I don't want to pretend right from the start that girls and young women are a monolithic, homogenous group. And so intersectionality must always be at the forefront. We've got our lens on gender right now, but obviously, girls would have different experience depending on that combination of multiple social factors. Black girls and white girls will have different experiences to maybe Hispanic girls, and able-bodied, disabled kids will have different experiences too. And indeed, if we're looking right front-loaded it from the off, if we're looking at how misogyny and maybe sexism impacts on participation, then clearly they're not experienced the same across all girls and young women. There's an awful lot of new conversation here around adultification of kids, like when do kids begin to be perceived as adults, and when do they stay young and treated as children. And there's a lot of Black writers who are pointing out that Black girls in particular are adultified much earlier than white girls, and that leads to all sorts of problems that are caused by the adults who are, I'm going to just, plain language, who are falling into that trap based on probably prejudicial views. Anyway, without further ado, so let's bring this right down to practice, and I'm going to try and be a little bit more conversational with Jordan and anyone else who joins us. So thinking of the students you teach, do boys and girls engage in physical activity differently, and how? Now, Jordan, as the only teacher, I mean, I can reflect on my teaching over many years in London. In your classes, do boys and girls engage in physical activity differently, and how, if so, how would you describe the difference?
Yeah, and I want to say thank you for the way that you have introduced us into this topic. As a man, as a teacher, and as a father, like the most important thing for me when considering these topics is really to situate myself as an observer, to be able to try to understand people who are different from me and their experiences in my classroom. And so when I do think about the students that I teach, um, boys and girls do engage in physical activity differently. But like you said, these groups are not monolithic. And so there's so much nuance to who these kids are and the reasons that they do participate in physical activity and the ways they engage. But I'll start with a broad observation in that the boys in my classroom tend to come in seeking the like more traditional uh, competitive environment where
Mhm.
they believe that physical education is there to separate those of great ability versus those of less ability. And they want to kind of surround themselves with people who they think are, um, going back to our last conversation, quote unquote, good at PE, because they think that points on the scoreboard are the most important thing. Whereas most of the girls who I interact with do not come into my class with that competitive edge, but rather they're more focused on the social experience that the physical activity can provide. So a lot of the conversations that I have with my young women are around wanting to be with their friends in a setting where they can talk, they can listen to music. A lot of dancing happens in my class, even if dance isn't the unit of study. I watched my students play a modified volleyball game today called Nitro Ball, and I
Yeah.
look over and the girls at one of my nets were playing, but they were also singing along to Spice Girls and dancing and just really enjoying themselves. Whereas, on the other side of my net, I have one core group of athletic boys who were very intent on making sure they knew what the score was and setting up proper volleyball plays. And um, again, not to create like paint with a really broad brush, but there are some differences in what I see the students that I interact with and when they come into PE.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And it is the fascination of observation. And I guess so. Just a little bit of background before we could really come back to that. So I think, if we're talking about engagement in physical activity globally, and this is clearly going to vary around the world. So the World Health Organization, and as someone from a critical perspective, I would always question the figures, but these figures carry huge amount of currency in policy making conversations. And these figures that came out 2 years ago. 81% of 11 to 17-year-olds globally are inactive, which the World Health Organization defines as insufficiently active to sustain good health. Yeah, as someone from a critical perspective, I would question what these figures, how they're achieved, how they are arrived at, and what they mean, and how they impact policy. So these fuel crises, and policy is often a knee-jerk reaction to a perceived crisis. But without going into that, because that's quite a heavy conversation, so most young people do not sustain or do not build a really positive relationship with physical activity. Certainly in the UK over here, we're talking about 45% is like the official figure. With the data that we collect on MyMove, some schools are able to show much higher figures, which is great, and that's probably because of the data collection tools and also really defining what is physical activity. And then within organized sport, this is a US figure, 70% drop out before the age of 13. And so that's obviously kids who were in sport through elementary school into middle school. And they drop out in huge numbers. Now, that is clearly a call to action. There's something going on there that's where young people learn really quite early in life that sport's not for them. Um, so for anybody who's interested in young people having uh, joyful, wonderful experiences in sport that are going to be sustained over their life course, there's an awful long way to go. And this was a US figure. An organization called Women in Sport published this figure last year that they say between top of elementary school and end of high school, around 1 million girls will drop out. And the dropout rate is, and indeed the activity rate, is always skewed in favor of boys. That's not to say that the boys are all active and they all sustain activity, but the issues that we're dealing with are more pronounced amongst girls and young women. So the question remains, why? And this is a very difficult question to unpick. And I would always start with what's at the core of our subject. Physical education is about the physical. You cannot escape the physical. So as a self-proclaimed constructivist, and I want to ask a question: what does it mean to a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 15-year-old? What does it mean to be a boy or a girl, to be a man or a woman? What does that mean to them, and where do they get those meanings? Now, if, unlike me, you don't believe that these meanings are constructed and that they are innate, then that's fine. But we're on a really different page, and I'm not sure we'll find that much common ground. So I believe that as young people grow up, they make sense of the world, and they make sense of the world mainly through words. Words are really powerful. And when it comes to the body, it is always gendered, almost always gendered. So it means different things to be a boy or a girl as manifested through the body. And there's research that shows that very young children can gender a body. And it's normally, and again, really relevant to our world, it's normally through the way the body moves. So when I was working in university, I used to play this clip of a children's TV show where they had these like little monsters and they would dance. In other words, they would move to music. And it was so evident who was presented, even though they were sort of gender neutral, they clearly weren't. And young children would have picked up that some of these little monster things were moving as traditionally women or girls would have moved, much more feminized movement, and others were much more masculinized. And then when we unpicked it, it was really clear like what gave those signals off. Now, the point here on this little chart is that this, of course, what we're talking about are binaries. And there's very little middle ground as the way this is presented. And that doesn't actually reflect certainly pre-adolescent experiences, because kids tend or often work across these binaries. And then as they get older, they feel less comfortable being on the wrong side of the binary. And that's why, if we go back to those figures, that is probably one of the explanations around dropout. Because if we look at how the body is used, and if we take these, and I've just put these 6 or 7 words here, they tend to be gendered words. I remember a few years ago being at a wedding and watching people dancing at a wedding, and I was fascinated by how gendered the use of the body was on the dance floor. And it was really evident that the men were taking up much more space. They felt entitled to take up much more space. Their movements were much more expansive. The women were dancing in a much more restrained way. Now, of course, that intersectionality comes into play there as well. If I happen to be at a wedding from, that was a white British wedding predominantly, and if it was from the Indian subcontinent, people would have been dancing differently. If it was from the Caribbean, it would have been dancing differently, etc. So use of the body is different around the world. But clearly power, strength, speed is often associated with male uses of the body, whereas precision and elegance and control is often associated with female use of the body. Now, if we believe in a concept of freedom as an educator, we want young people to have genuine freedom to be able to move and use their bodies how they see fit. So the two images that I got here, obviously Serena Williams, throughout her career, she transgressed many and tore up many stereotypes of how women were meant to play tennis. And Nike celebrated that. Now, again, I think this is potentially really problematic if we ask, like, does that speak to young women? Nike always presented it as it does speak to young women and it should. So you've got this notion that a woman is free if they can own spaces that have traditionally been male spaces. And there's probably a lot in that. But the autonomy piece, the agency is really, really important. So when you're working with a 14-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid who is making sense of the world, their place in it, and what it means to be masculine and feminine, I'm not always sure. Like if they're showing, they're leaning towards being able to move in this in powerful ways, in strong ways, in competitive ways, then great, they've got the freedom to do that. Now, I was fascinated, certainly as a British person, when I watched the Netflix documentary here around the Dallas Cowboys cheerleading squad. I was really hooked on that, partly because that's quite alien to sort of, British culture. It's a very traditionally US thing, I suppose. And Jordan, you could correct me if I'm wrong there. But notions of how the body is used there to be elegant, to be beautiful, the language around that, the reinforcement that these young women always had about their beauty and the elegance of their movement I just found it astounding. And I also found it must be really exhausting to always have to live to those beauty standards. So how does that make sense? How do we bring that into play in our classes and in our curriculum? Ultimately, I'm in the position, I suppose, where it is that freedom piece. Now, I was reflecting before this on a book club session that HPE hosted around a book that is obviously really popular at the moment, The Anxious Generation. And I shared in a conversation with Jordan and on the HPE Collective some a podcast that asked questions about that. And it said that the anxious generation presents two simplistic arguments. In other words, social media and the way young people relate to social media is by and large a bad thing and is a problematic thing. And I was reflecting on that in terms of gender, movement, physical activity, and our space. And this is where it does get really murky. And there's no simple answer here. So social media, of course, can be really restrictive and can really reinforce traditional beauty types, oppressive sexism. It can really reinforce that this is what it means to be a young woman, and really deny people those freedoms. But on the flip side, you can also find brilliant stuff about that is really changing the way girls and young women move. And that is only a reflection of wider society. So if we look since Venus and Serena Williams were doing their thing on a tennis court, look at the huge changes that have taken place in the way women are presented as moving. And I'm not just talking about elite sport. I think the fitness industry can be quite toxic, but it can also be really liberating. Now, what CrossFit has done to present strong, powerful women is astounding. And Hydrox, is that what it's called? Hydrox is doing the same thing. And there's loads of examples. My social media feed is full of men and women moving in ways that they want to move and taking ownership of that in a way that I think we probably haven't experienced before. And I can only think that that is a really positive thing for young people to see. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. Jordan, jump in and correct me if it doesn't. Um,
No, it definitely does. So the the CrossFit example is my favorite. That's a world that I've lived in for a long time. And the word liberating, I think, is a good one to understand. First of all, what are the invitations that we're giving our kids in our classes to join in the physical activity? How are those phrased? It's really important the language that we use in order to bring them into a space where they might feel uncomfortable. I have two young Hispanic women currently in my fitness class, my weight training class, and for the first part of the semester, I spend a lot of time me owning what we're doing in class, so I can talk a lot about movement mechanics and how to properly structure sets so that you're not overtraining and like all these considerations related to what it looks and should be like in the weight room. And quite frequently, they ask me, Mr. Manley, can we go take a run on the walking track today? And my response is yes, because that movement is just as good and positive. But the curiosity I have is, what kind of culturally and related to their gender has been communicated to them to make them believe that, well, today we're learning a little bit about the bench press, or we're focusing in on some dumbbell movements.
yeah,
What communications have they received, and what have the invitations I've given them sounded like to disarm some of their hesitance, so that
yeah,
they can understand that these are places where they also belong, and they don't
yeah,
have to have the same goals as a competitive CrossFit athlete or a
yeah,
competitive powerlifter. But where does this movement serve you in your life? I think
yeah,
that's a really important consideration.
yeah, yeah. Really nicely put. Thank you. Um, I'm always really wary of the time on these things. I think we could sit on those conversations for a long time. I'm not sure how.
Yeah.
So, so this is called the activity gap, and I just wanted to bring these questions to the fore, and these are inspired by I can't remember if I mentioned it before, but this is probably my favourite educator, US professor Gloria Ladson Billin, and in terms of the attainment gap, by race. She questions it, and she says, "Is it an attainment gap or is it an investment gap?" Um, and she presents a very compelling case that it's actually an investment gap, and we shouldn't. By calling it an attainment gap, we are shifting responsibility to individuals and to communities, and we're saying that certain individuals um, are at fault for their own lack of attainment. Um, so she's looking at the structures that produce these gaps. So I'm just asked some questions around here. Is it an activity gap or is it an investment gap? Now, I'm also wary of Title IX. Now, as a UK citizen, again, I stand to be corrected, but my understanding of Title IX is that it is not legal by federal law to invest heavily, to more heavily for any service, public service provided to men compared to women. So those funding streams must have parity. Um, but that's just the financial investment, and there's emotional investment. There's also energy investment. There's attention investment. These are all very scarce resources. So a teacher only has a certain amount of attention. Who gets that attention and why? Um, Expectations is a fascinating conversation around gender and sport and physical activity that Jordan just touched upon. Whose expectations uh, uh, count and whose expectations contribute towards shaping lived experiences? What boys, girls, men, women expect from themselves and expect from others, and indeed a cultural gap. Now, clearly, if we go back to intersectionality, then what is defining man, woman, and how the body should be used, and what the very murky space that is ideal body and ideal beauty forms. And I think these are very difficult constructs that, as a transformational educator, I think we really have to begin to pull apart. If we go back to what I was saying about the Dallas Cowboys and the cheerleaders, I think that can be really restrictive. And what we're trying to do is help young people find their space through their world. Now, does that mean if a young woman buys it into, as Jordan just said, whether it's from a particular cultural or community, or whether they're getting ideal body shape and notions of beauty from their media feeds, does that mean that they shouldn't? And is the role of the educator to tell them that that's wrong? Probably not. The role of education is to expand, not to restrict. So how do we have those really sensitive conversations over time? Because the question that Jordan just asked, those young women will shift, or might shift, from essentially doing CV, and I'm going to use quote unquote calorie burning activity, i.e. jogging, to strength activities when something happens in their lived experience that they change the way they perceive their body, what it is, and how they can use it. And that is the very definition of liberation, being able to use their body in the way that they want. And part of that is opening the window of curiosity and just examining that. But clearly, we're talking about building muscle, and look, like building muscle, like seriously. This is about slenderness. This is about, I would argue that this is about the avoidance of fat, and fatness is badness. And that's another whole argument or conversation around what the body should look like. What is set against the binary: fatness is badness, slenderness is goodness. Very simplistic binaries. I'm not sure that holds up, especially to educate young people for what's in store for them as they go through their lives. And clearly bodies change as they go through their lives. So the cultural gap, the expectation gap, and the formative years experience, which is really related to expectations, there has been so much work done on what's the expectation of infant boys and infant girls, toddler boys and girls, and what their play forms are and what they play with, and how boys are so readily given implements to throw and catch and kick, and girls are given implements and toys that reflect maternalism and caring and empathy and looking after. And again, coming away from the binary, we come into a much more fluid existence. Would little girls benefit from having implements to throw, kick, and catch? Of course they would. Would little boys benefit from having toys which require them to develop empathy? Of course they would. Fast forward, you've got kids coming into Jordan's class, and their primary focus is, am I beating you? There's an awful lot of really healthy activity going on in the way Jordan described the way the girls would enjoying and engaging in their volleyball. So just to wrap up and bring in this really to practical into your class. So on here are the barriers, and on here are some of the things that we can do to really challenge these barriers. And this is taken from that Women in Sport project, but I'm sure there's not a single PE teacher on here who doesn't get some of the top reasons that girls say they disengage. And the first two really talk to what Jordan and I have discussed as being just really good PE, really good inclusive PE, which starts with what is the definition of being good at PE. So if we start to challenge that and create much more inclusive environments where being good is that you're engaging over a sustained period of time. How do we know that? Because MyMove gives you that data to do that. So MyMove becomes a transformational tool within a transformational program. And then we've got different definitions of being good, and we are judging kids on different terms. However, when girls talk about being judged, of course, what they're talking about is being physically judged, and the sense of being watched and being gazed at. And this is incredibly uncomfortable. And I don't think that is just about reframing success. I think that needs to be addressed head on here. You need to get to the causes that are causing insecurity and young people to feel unsafe, psychologically unsafe and uncomfortable because of comments, verbal comments, other behaviors, other gazes, etc. Very nuanced behavior that most teenagers begin to become very aware of. So physical and psychological safety is so important. And I just want to really add here before I continue around this notion of privilege. And we started by talking about Jordan and I coming at this through the eyes of two men. And within the world of physical activity, I can't think of a greater manifestation of male privilege. So if I bring that really to my lived experiences, I'm always very, very wary that I can put on like a t-shirt, pair of shorts, whatever it is, and I can hit the gym, I can go for a run, I can do pretty much whatever activities I want to without having to think about how that clothing makes my body appear, whether it makes certain parts of my body appear big or small. I'm not saying men are totally oblivious to this, but I have never once in my life gone out and worried about, oh, I wonder if I wax my legs. Like never. And as a cyclist, I did wax my legs. And that used to get the odd comment, but did it ever bother me? No. But, when we're talking about what are the barriers, this is real life stuff for a lot of kids. How do young women deal with the physical changes during adolescence? Now, of course, young men are impacted by that as well. But I would probably argue, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, that young men, by and large, nowhere near as much as young women. The changes that are taking place, whether we're talking about their period once a month, whether we're talking about changes, shifts in distribution of body fat, etc. When kids have a growth spurt in pre-adolescence, their movement becomes clumsy until they catch up with that growth spurt, right? We've all seen kids have longer levers and, where they were catching and throwing and bouncing a ball, all of a sudden their center of gravity's changed. They can't change direction. They feel clumsy. How do we create a space where we're saying, you know what, that's okay. You're going to catch up, stick with it for a while, or we're going to make it a little bit easier. And that's just like growing when you're having to deal with the appearance of body hair for the first time, and you're meant to be wearing like shorts or a t-shirt or going swimming. This is, kids need to feel really safe and secure in how they're going to navigate those personal changes. So yeah, I really think we do need to reframe success. We really do need to address any of the behaviors that make other people feel that this is not for them, and really work harder to create safe spaces, to celebrate, to display a whole range of bodies doing a whole range of movement. And Jordan speaks about this more and better than I do, but really say, look, success is finding that meaning. It's not about beating someone else. It's not about being the best. But if you find a relationship to physical activity that helps your life flourish, because this is a serious problem, pressures of work and other responsibilities. And again, it hits some girls very, very hard, where those pressures come from, what other responsibilities they have, looking after younger siblings, etc. So, if they can't be on performance pathways or find sport uh, something meaningful because they're competing, then we need to say, okay, check in for 15 minutes, go to the fitness room for 15 minutes, go for a walk for 15 minutes, because that will help your life flourishing. Find your connection. And we need to be better and constantly get better. I think we have got better over the last few years, but are we all really comfortable having the conversation around body changes, around thinness and fatness? How do we, a couple of sessions ago, I was looking at the feedback kids gave on My Move when a young woman said, my fitness goal is to lose fat. And I think that takes a really skilled practitioner to address that in a sensitive and yet an informed way that does give the agency to the young person, not to say to them, you don't need to lose fat, or to say you really should, and you should lose more fat than that. This is about, how do you give agency? How do you allow the young person to take control of the biggest expression of self that they have, which is, what does my body look like and what do I want it to look like? So we've touched upon some really difficult themes. I hope it made sense. I'm going to be quiet and bump it over to Jordan.
Yeah, one closing thought there on having the conversation. It goes beyond having the conversation with the student as well. We talked last week about stakeholders, and I know I'm about to speak in uh, anecdotal evidence, and perhaps this is going to be taken as a broad generalization, but I think there is some truth to it. Um, every year at open house, I get to meet some of my students' parents. This has only happened twice, but I've had parents with their students next to them come to me and place the expectations on what my PE class should do for their student. The one time it happened with a female student, the conversation was, hey, my girl really needs to lose some weight. And so we're really happy that she's in PE class this semester. She really needs to lose some weight. And so, keep us updated on how she's doing and participating. And it was a really uncomfortable place to be. And I'll be honest with you, as a young teacher, when that happened, I didn't know how to have that conversation with the parent. Obviously, I was able to talk with the student privately in class about what my expectations were and what PE is for, but I was not able to address that effectively with the parent. And the only time it's happened with a male student, like Greg told us earlier, the message was entirely different and almost empowered that student. Like the dad came in and was like, "Hey, my boy here, he's just hit his growth spurt. He's really skinny right now. We got to bulk him up." You know, it was also focused on the way his body looked, but the two messages were drastically different. That the purpose of the PE class was to fix these kids in some way or another, and only one of those ways was so emotionally damaging, and it was geared toward the female student. So, um, you know, just being super cognizant of the gender activity gap and understanding the way students receive messages uh, is the first step to being able to inform all stakeholders in the purpose of your PE class and why you do what you do and how you might have an impact with their students. So obviously, I want to say thank you to Greg for joining us this afternoon for another really powerful session talking about a really serious subject that holds a lot of weight. Obviously, Greg invited you at the beginning of the webinar to share your experiences with us. We recognize that we come from a standpoint where we do not represent the population in which we are speaking about, and everyone has so much to their identity that we can't possibly represent every single listener today. But talk to us. Tell us what your experiences as a young mover were, and tell us about what you're seeing in your classroom with your kids right now. Because again, hosting the conversation is the first step for us to be able to make any impact here. I want to say thank you for listening to the My Move webinar series. This was episode 4 out of 6. HPE Radio is close to 100 listeners, and we're excited to be launching a new podcast series soon called Teacher Takeover, where me and Jeff Bartlett will be interviewing teachers and going behind the scenes to understand more about how they operate in their classroom, to really just do a lot of sharing of practice and to highlight really awesome teachers around the world. Again, share with a friend, and we'll see you next week.